Hi there. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk about a simple geometry node setup and some material setup to create a sort of bit of abstract art, a bit like what you can see on the screen now. I've actually used a couple of materials, but the main one that I did was this sort of shiny, coloured metallic sort of look. It's a bit like crystallized bismuth, I guess, but I've animated it as well. So I'll demonstrate how to do all this. If you enjoy these tutorials, don't forget to click like and subscribe. Feel free to comment or ask questions or even dislike the video. And if you don't like the video, I'd be very interested to see what the issues you spotted were so that I can improve going forward. If you're a Patreon supporter, I do upload these files for any use available to my Patreon supporters, and I upload tutorials quite regularly. So let's start the tutorial. So to begin with, we just need to add some geometry, and we'll just add a plane. It doesn't really matter what the geometry is because we're not going to see it. And then we click on here and we can go to the geometry node editor. I'm just going to press N to close that window on the right for the moment, and then click new. And you can see it just calls it geometry nodes. We are only going to create one, so I won't worry about giving it a specific name. What I will do though is open a second window and we'll put the first one back to 3D viewport just so that we can see what's going on. So at the moment, the geometry, which is the geometry coming from our plane, is going straight to the output, and that's why we can see our plane. If I cut that, you can see the plane disappears and we've just got an origin point there. The plane is still there. If I look up here, you can see it there, but it isn't visible. So I'm going to create something called a volume cube. So I'm just going to add a node and we're going to search for the node. So if I start typing volume, and you can see the first option there is volume cube. And then I'm going to attach that to the geometry output. And you can see we've got something appeared here. Just gone to orthographic mode, and I'm going to remove all the grids just to make things easier. So this is essentially a cube of mist. We start to look off axis, you can see it goes slightly fuzzy. We've created a volumetric cube because we want to be able to play around with the shape of the cube on its internal faces, as it were. Some of the settings we'll leave at default and some of the others will change. This one down here is the main one because this volume cube is really constructed of voxels, which is a three-dimensional pixel, a pixel being a two-dimensional shape. And the higher these numbers, the more detail we can have. So we will change these, but I'll leave them at 32 for the moment. The resolution is how many voxels are in the axis that this relates to. So assuming we have them all the same, this is currently saying there are 32 voxels along the x-axis, 32 on the y, and 32 on the z. A higher number will give us more voxels or more pixels in that particular axis and give us a finer resolution. And we will want more, but we'll leave it at 32 for the moment. To start to create more interesting shape than just a fuzzy cloud, I'm going to add another node called volume to mesh. So this changes this volumetric cube back into a mesh. And you can see there it is. So that seems like a very hard way to create a slightly rounded looking cube. And that's because obviously it fades out towards the edges. And you can play around with thresholds in here and so on. But you can just stick with the default, it's fine. We'll add a couple of additional nodes in here. But before we do, let's just go to materials. And we'll just create a material, I'll call it shiny. And we'll make it fairly metallic. And let's just make it a bluish color at the moment. And copy that down into the viewport display as well. So you can see I've created this material. It's associated with the plane, but it's not visible here. Even if I go to the material preview options, it's just showing a clay form cube at the moment. And that's because we need to set the material. So we go up to here and we type set. You can see we can set material and drop that there. And then we can select the shiny material I created, and there it is. And finally, because you can see it's faceted at the moment, we want that to be smooth. Now I can right click here and say shade smooth, but you see again nothing changes because that's setting the original plane to shade smooth, which we can't see at the moment. It's not setting this. So if I've just used Shift A there to bring up the menu, and we just start typing set shade smooth, and we can then drop that in there, and now you can see we've smoothed this cube out. Now we want to do something a little more interesting with it. So we want to affect the density of that cube in some places. We want it to not be there, basically. So I'm now going to add, under texture, a Voronoi texture. And just as a point of note, if I turn the density down, you can see the cube, first of all, shrinks a little bit at the edges and then disappears. So I'm now going to put the distance option of my Voronoi texture into the density option of my cube. And you can see something interesting is happening there. And I'm going to set this to 4D because I'm going to want to change this over time as well. Other than that, I'm sticking with the defaults for the moment, although I think we will turn the scale up a little. But you can see, apart from a little bit of wobbles on the surfaces and some dots here, it hasn't made a massive difference to our cube. So we need to add utilities color, a color ramp, and we'll drop that in there. And we'll start to pull the left hand side up, and you can see our cube starts to dissolve. And that in itself might be an effect that you want. If I turn the outliner off, you can see our cube has started to change into the shape that we wanted. And you can make it more positive by bringing the right hand side in a little bit as well. So where you have it is entirely up to you. Perhaps we'll turn the scale down a little, but you can see it's still quite crude. So what I'm going to do now is select all of those and we'll double it. We'll put it up to 64. So you can see it hasn't changed the noise scale, but it's made pixels or voxels that make up these shapes smaller and therefore gives us a smoother line. Still not perfectly smooth, you could go higher still, but it does have quite an effect on the memory used. So if I go to a really low resolution, let's say 16, you can see that's very blocky now. But I felt 64 was a reasonable compromise. And if I play around with W, you start to see what's going to happen. Going quite fast. So I'm going up by 0.1 at a time, but you can see the noise pattern is evolving. So there's another node that's quite useful. If I search for that one and we type scene time. You can actually do this by creating a driver by just typing #frames, but scene time gives you the option to use seconds as well. But in this case, it's something that I want to involve based on just the frames. It's entirely up to you really what you use. So if I just plug frames, which is obviously the frame number we're on, into the W value, what happens now is as we advance through the animation, the W value is evolved. But obviously one frame and advancement is way too much, so we need to make that a lot smaller. I'm going to stick with a 250 frame animation for the moment, but we now need to add a math function. So we'll go to utilities, under math, and we'll just put that in there, and we'll change that to divide. And then for the moment, let's try divide it by 1000. So the frame number will be divided by 1000 before that's passed on to the changes for the Verona texture. So if we now advance frames, you can see that's now advancing much more slowly. So you can see it's changing a little bit at a time now. But what if we want to control that more easily? Well, I can take this group input here and I can take this out to there. And if I now press N and bring up the right hand side and click group, you can see I've got this input called value here. If I select that, we'll give it the name speed. And now if I go to modifier properties, I've got a speed option here and I can just type a number in here. I could say 500 to make it quicker. So you can see the shape is changing more rapidly there. So for the geometry nodes, that's all we need to do. And obviously you could use different noise options and so on to give you different effects. So we'll change over to the shader editor now, and that's the basic shader that we've got. I'm going to add some lights into the scene, or at least one light. We'll put an area light, I think, over the top. And we'll just try 500 watts, something like that. We'll see how that works. And we'll set the background to black and we'll see what that's looking like. Currently that's in cycles. If we change over to Eevee, it should render a little quicker, but in fact, a lot of the work is being done to create the geometry node simulation. So it doesn't make a huge difference. I'm going to turn on ambient occlusion up here in render properties. We'll turn on bloom, but we'll drop the intensity back quite a bit and perhaps the radius as well. Quite importantly, we'll turn on screen space reflections, which then you can see illuminates the internal. If I turn that off, you can see it's dark shadows there, but turn it on and we get some light bouncing around. If you're doing this in cycle, you won't have these settings. I added a volumetric cube, a genuine volumetric cube around it, just to give it a bit of mist and so on, but I've covered that many times, so we won't do that here. But we're ready now to have a look at the material. So first of all, I'm going to add a converter, which is a color ramp. And we'll take that into the base color, which has gone gray at the moment. And then we'll add an input, which is a layer weight input. So this is a node which detects the angle that light has bounced off the object before it reaches the camera, although of course it all happens in reverse in reality. We'll take the facing output into the color ramp, and then we'll just put a color onto this lowest level and we'll make that blue. Go to the next point. In fact, we'll stick with white on that one, I think. Then we'll add some more nodes. and we'll just spread those around a bit. Let's make this one red, and then perhaps we'll go with green for this one, perhaps not quite such a bright green, and then it's a yellow with this one, and maybe make that a slightly darker yellow. It's entirely up to you. I found making them a little darker helped it to work a little better. So at the moment that's a very colourful object, and you can see how the colours change with the angle that the camera is seeing the bounce light from. I used ease, which will change it again. I think we'll move that one up there, and I left the blend at 0.5. So that's a start, and then we'll have a look at what we've got here. So we'll put the metallic up a little bit higher, and we'll turn the roughness down something like 0.2, 0.3, something like that, so it's even shinier now. And now we need to give it some surface texture. So I'm going to add another Voronoi texture. So under textures, we'll select Voronoi, and we'll also add under vector a bump node. This gives us, as it were, fake geometry. So it's not really adding to the geometry, but it's making Blender know that we want it to render artifacts that we create as if they were geometry. So I'm going to take the distance output from my Voronoi texture into the height on the bump node, and then the output goes into the normal input. Normals are how we determine what geometry is all about, and you can already see we're getting a more interesting shape now. And I changed from Euclidean to Chebyshev, however that's pronounced, and again changed to 4D, gives me that extra parameter which I can change over time, as you can see. So let's try a scale of about 90, and you can see we've got quite an interesting shape there, and it makes it a lot more interesting in general, I think. So again, I wanted this to change over time, but what I wanted this to do is to be connected to the speed of my other system, so the geometry node system itself. I will actually open another window here and go back to the geometry node editor. In my material window, so let's shrink this down a bit. So this is shiny, my material. I'm going to add converter, which is a math node. I'm going to make two math nodes. This one's going to be set to divide, and this one set to multiply. The output of the multiply goes into the divide, and I'm going to put 1 there. So whatever comes out of this one is divided into 1. So if this is 1, we get 1. If it's 2, we get 0.5 out, and so on. And we'll take that into W. So I can actually use this over here, because what I want for the multiply value is I want this to be associated with the speed aspect. If I increase the speed at which my main geometry changes, I want the speed of the material changes to increase as well. So if I come over here and I right click, I can say copy as new driver. Then I come over here and I can right click and say paste driver. Now you can see that's got the same number. If I change this back to say 1000, that's changed to 1000 as well. And we know that, of course, has changed the speed of my geometry node. So that's one way that I can link, in this case, a material property to a geometry node property and keep them in sync. For the frames, I could do the same thing and essentially expose the frames number and then use that, but it's just as easy to click in here because we don't have a scene time node for materials. It's just as easy to click in here and type hash frame. Now you can see it's showing the current frame, and that's being divided by the value here, which is reflected here. So we've got it on 1000, which is relatively slow. And in fact, because this is unlikely to play at the speed it will when you have created the animation, you need to bear that in mind, that it may be a lot faster. You'll want a slower animation rather than a quicker one. And that basically is all there is to it. And I then just animated my camera moving through it. I did add a volumetric fog to the whole scene just to give it a bit more interest. We could perhaps, because we're not getting much in the way of reflections there at the moment, we can turn the thickness down a little bit on our screen space reflections parameters. And that's just giving us a little bit more light bounce. Or you can use cycles. And you can see we've got a lot more bounce there, but it clearly takes a lot longer to render that. I think what's interesting about this scene is the bounce light itself. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, let me know. I will upload the original file for my Patreon supporters to use as normal. If you liked or disliked the video, don't forget to click that. If you have any questions, feel free to put those in the comments below about this or any other tutorials. Otherwise, I will see you in the next one. Thanks a lot.